My name is Wanda Holt. I'm 31 years old, and I built a regional marketing campaign from scratch that generated $2 million in revenue for a mid-sized consumer brand in under 8 months. A number that got me promoted twice in 3 years and earned me a corner office. I still sometimes walk into and pause, just for a second, because I remember the garage. I always remember the garage, but I'll get to that. First, let me tell you about the party. Frank Holt turned 60 on a Saturday in October, which meant my mother had been planning this event since approximately the previous February. Diane Holt does not throw parties. She constructs them. With the focused architectural precision of a woman who understands that a social event is not a celebration but a statement, and that the statement she has been making for the past 22 years requires constant maintenance and regular public reinforcement. The backyard had been transformed. String lights threaded through the oak trees. Round tables with ivory linens and low floral centerpieces in burgundy and gold. A catered spread from the Italian place on Meridian that Frank liked, because Frank's preferences were always the ones that got honored in this house. A 3-tier cake on a separate table near the pergola, with Frank, 60 and still going, written across the top, in gold fondant script that had cost my mother, I estimated, somewhere between $200 and $300. 60 guests, maybe more. Neighbors, co-workers of Frank's from the plant, couples from their church, Brenda's friends, who always showed up to Holt family events. Like they had been on the original guest list from birth. I had driven 40 minutes from my apartment to be here. I had brought a gift, a leather-bound journal, and a bottle of the Scotch Frank mentioned once, 18 months ago, at a different family dinner, because I pay attention to things like that even when no one pays attention to me. I was wearing the green dress. The good one. The one I bought with my first real paycheck from the marketing job. The one that fits correctly and photographs well and communicates, without announcing it, that I am doing fine. Better than fine. That the garage did not finish me. That I built something out of what this family left me with. Which was not much. And I built it quietly and without anyone's help. And without ever once asking this house for anything. It was not willing to give freely. Which, by age 12, I had calculated was very nearly nothing. I want to tell you something about growing up in a house where you are not the real daughter. Not the dramatic version, not the Cinderella version with the evil stepmother and the obvious cruelty that everyone around you can see and name. I am talking about the quieter version. The version that operates through omission and arrangement and the specific surgical use of normal as a weapon. Diane Holt did not hit me. She did not starve me. She did not say, in plain language, that I was less than Brenda, or less than Cassie, or less than any of the other people in this house, who had Frank's last name sewn into the fabric of their belonging here. She did not have to say it, she arranged it. When I was 9, the year she divorced my father Ray and married Frank, I was moved out of the second bedroom to make space for Brenda, who was coming to live with us on weekends. The second bedroom had a window that faced the backyard, and a closet big enough for a child's clothes, and a small desk where I used to do homework under a lamp my father had bought me. I was moved to the garage. Not the whole garage, a portion of it, sectioned off with drywall that Frank put up over a long weekend, with a single window unit that cooled it in summer, and a space heater that struggled in winter, and a door that locked from the outside, in a way that was never fully explained to me. It was presented as practical temporary. We'll figure something more permanent soon. Wanda, you know how things are right now. I was in that garage for 4 years before I stopped waiting for the more permanent solution to arrive. By 13, I had stopped calling it temporary. By 15, I had stopped thinking about it at all, which is the specific emotional adaptation of a child who has correctly identified that the hope of a different outcome is more painful than the acceptance of the current one. If you grew up in a house where you were tolerated rather than wanted, where your presence was managed rather than celebrated, drop a comment, because I need you to know that what I am describing does not always look like abuse from the outside. Sometimes it looks like a family photo on the wall of a hallway, and sometimes it looks like that photo not having you in it. There is a wall in Diane and Frank's house, the main hallway, the one you walk through from the front door to the kitchen. That functions in the Holt family's domestic mythology as a kind of official record. Framed photographs in matching frames, organized chronologically, telling the story of this family's life together. Frank and Diane's wedding photo. Brenda at her high school graduation. Cassie's first soccer trophy. Frank's retirement party at the plant. A family Christmas from 2009, where everyone is in matching sweaters. And the tree is lit. And the expressions are the specific, performed happiness of people who have agreed, for the duration of the photograph, to present a particular version of themselves, to whoever might one day look at this wall and assess them. I have looked at that wall hundreds of times, over 22 years. I am not in any of those photographs, not because no photographs of me exist. They exist. I have some of them on my phone. Birthday dinners I attended, Christmases where I drove the 40 minutes and brought the gifts and sat at the table and was, by every observable measure, present. But the photographs on that wall are not a record of who was in this house. They are a record of who belongs to it. And that distinction, established when I was 9 years old and refined over the following 2 decades, with the quiet consistency of a policy rather than a decision, is the thing I am talking about when I say that Diane Holt never needed to say anything out loud. The wall said it. I arrived at the party at 6:15. Cassie met me at the gate. Cassie, who is 29, and has always occupied the uncomfortable middle position of someone who knows the truth about a situation and has spent years choosing the comfort of not naming it. She hugged me, genuinely, I think. Cassie's affection has always felt real, even when her courage hasn't. You look good, she said. Thanks, I said. Where do I put this? She took the gift and pointed me toward the gift table near the pergola. I navigated through the yard, past Frank's co-workers, past the garden club women, who had known my mother for 15 years, and looked at me with the polite, uncertain smiles of people who had been told a version of my story, and were not sure how to categorize me in person. I found a glass of sparkling water. I found a spot near the edge of the string lights, where I could stand with my back to the fence and see the full width of the yard. This is a habit I developed in childhood and have never lost. In any room, any gathering, any social environment, I find the position with the widest sightline and I put my back to something solid. My therapist, 2 years ago, described this as a hypervigilance response. I described it as good spatial awareness. We agreed to disagree. Brenda found me 8 minutes after I arrived. Brenda is 33, Frank's older daughter from his first marriage, and she has the specific energy of someone who has decided that family loyalty means defending the hierarchy rather than questioning it. She was wearing a wrap dress in a deep burgundy that matched the floral arrangements, which told me she had been involved in the planning. Wanda, she said, with the warm and slightly territorial tone she always used with me. Glad you could make it. Wouldn't miss it, I said. Mom's been running around since this morning. You should go say hi to her. I noticed the mom, Brenda always said mom, when referring to Diane in my presence, not as an accident, as a reminder. A small, consistent recalibration of where the lines in this family were drawn, and which side of them I was standing on. I'll find her, I said. Brenda smiled, moved on. I turned back to the yard at 7:08 p.m. I know the time because I looked at my phone 12 seconds before it happened, checking a work message that turned out to be irrelevant. The gate at the side of the house opened. A man walked in. He was in his mid-50s, medium height, wearing a dark jacket, and carrying himself with the careful, deliberate posture of someone who has rehearsed an arrival. He had gray at his temples and a way of scanning the yard. Methodical, left to right. That felt familiar to me in a way I could not immediately name. He stopped scanning when he reached me, and I understood, before he took a single step in my direction, before he said a single word, before any of the rational processing had time to complete itself. I understood in the way you understand things that your body has known longer than your mind has been willing to admit. Exactly who he was, Ray, my father, the man my mother had told me, for 22 years, had chosen to leave, had chosen a different life. Had decided when I was 9 years old that his daughter was not worth staying for. He was walking toward me across my stepfather's birthday party, with the careful, measured steps of a man who had been trying to reach this moment for a very long time. My water glass was in my hand. I did not drop it, but my fingers went cold. He stopped 3 feet away. He said, "Wanda." Not a question, not an introduction, just my name, spoken with the specific weight of someone who has said it privately, to themselves, in empty rooms, enough times that saying it aloud to the actual person feels like completing a sentence that has been left unfinished for 2 decades. I said, "I know who you are," he said. "I know you do." He paused. "I also know what you were told." Behind me, I heard the party continuing. The low current of 60 people, eating and talking and existing in the pleasant amber warmth of Frank's string lights, unaware that the architecture of the evening had just fundamentally shifted. He said, "I didn't leave, Wanda. I was kept away. And I have the documents to prove it." I looked at him. 22 years of a story I had been given. A story I had built my understanding of myself around. The story of a father who had decided I wasn't worth his time. A story that had shaped every relationship I'd had, and every room I'd stood in with my back to the wall and my sightlines clear. That story was standing in Frank Holt's backyard, with gray at its temples and court documents, apparently, and it was looking at me, like I was the thing it had been driving toward for longer than I had been driving away from it. My marketing brain, the part of me that processes information in terms of data and narrative, and the gap between the story being told and the story that is true, registered the situation with the flat, clarifying precision of a campaign audit. The story I had been sold for 22 years was a campaign, and I was looking at the data that disproved it. "Tell me," I said. "There is a specific kind of silence that happens when a person says something true in a room full of people who have been comfortable with a lie. It is not dramatic. It does not crash like a wave or crack like thunder. It settles, slowly, completely, the way cold air settles into a room when a window has been left open in winter. You feel it before you understand it. Your body registers it before your mind has finished processing the words." Ray said, "I didn't leave." And that silence settled over Frank Holt's birthday party, like something that had been waiting 22 years for permission to arrive. I looked at him, really looked. The way I had not allowed myself to look in the first 30 seconds after he walked through the gate, when my brain was still running the defensive calculations of someone caught off guard in a public setting. Now I looked with the full, unguarded attention of a marketing manager who has spent 8 years learning to read the gap between what a message claims and what the evidence supports. He was not performing grief. He was not performing anything. He had the specific stillness of a man who had rehearsed this moment so many times that the rehearsal had burned away, and what remained was simply the fact of it, standing in a backyard he had never been invited to, saying the truest thing he knew to the daughter who had been told the opposite of it for 22 years. "You said you have documents," I said. "I do. Show me." He did not show me immediately, not because he was stalling. I could see the inside pocket of his jacket where the envelope sat, a slight rectangular outline against the dark fabric. But because at that precise moment, Diane Holt appeared. She came from the direction of the catering table, moving with the quick, controlled efficiency of a woman who has spent decades managing situations before they become visible to audiences. She must have seen him from across the yard. She must have recognized him from a distance and begun moving immediately, because she arrived beside me in under 30 seconds with a smile fixed on her face that did not reach her eyes by a margin of several inches. "Ray," she said. One word, his name, delivered with the flat, final authority of a woman closing a door. He looked at her. Something passed between them, not the residue of old affection, not the complicated warmth of people who once loved each other, and are now something else. Something harder than that. The specific, exhausted acknowledgement of 2 people who have been in opposition for a very long time and have arrived at the moment when the opposition becomes public. He said, "Diane," she said, still smiling, her voice low and controlled. "This is not the time or the place." From 3 feet to my left, Mrs. Patterson, who had lived next door to this house for 19 years and had watched me grow up with the quiet, observant attention of a woman who notices things and stores them carefully, said clearly and without apology, "I think this is exactly the time and the place." Diane looked at her. Mrs. Patterson looked back. The smile on my mother's face did not waver, but something behind it recalculated. If you have ever watched someone try to manage a truth the way you manage a public relations crisis, contain it, reframe it, redirect the room's attention before the story sets. Drop a comment. Because I have spent 8 years doing exactly that for brands, and I recognized every move my mother made in the next 4 minutes with the clinical precision of someone watching a playbook. She had written herself, being executed by someone else. Ree reached into his jacket pocket and removed the envelope. It was not dramatic. He did not hold it up. He did not announce it. He simply took it out and held it in his hand and looked at me and said, "These are copies. I have the originals at home. I've had them for years." He opened the envelope. The first document was a court filing. I could see the header from where I was standing. A domestic court case number, dated 2003, the year my parents divorced. He turned it so I could read it. It was a custody petition, filed by Ray, requesting joint physical custody of one minor child, Wanda Holt, age 9. I looked at it. I had been told, for 22 years, that my father had not fought for me. That when the marriage ended, he had accepted the separation without contest, had moved on without looking back, had chosen his own freedom over his daughter. That the silence from his direction was his choice, his design, his answer to the question of whether I was worth the effort. The document in his hand said he had filed for custody within 60 days of the divorce being finalized. "It was denied," he said quietly. "Your mother's attorney argued that I was unstable, that I had missed child support payments." He paused. I had not missed a single payment. The payments were going to a P.O. box Diane controlled. Her attorney presented them as unreceived. My mother said, "Ray, I am asking you one more time." "The P.O. box number is on the payment records," he said. He was not speaking to her. He was speaking to me. "I had a lawyer trace it 3 years ago. It's registered to Diane Holt at this address. I want to stop here and tell you something about what happens to your body. When a foundational story, a story you have organized your entire understanding of yourself around, begins to come apart in real time. It is not like anger. Anger is hot and directional. It knows where it is going and it moves fast. What I felt standing in that backyard was something slower and more total than anger. It was the sensation of a floor shifting, not collapsing, not breaking, but moving beneath you in a way that requires you to recalculate every assumption you have been making about the ground. I had built a career on the story of a girl whose father left, not consciously. I had not sat in therapy and said, "My abandonment shapes my professional drive." Though my therapist had, over 2 years, suggested this connection with increasing directness. But the story was structural. It was load-bearing. It was the explanation I had given myself for why I worked the way I worked. Relentlessly, independently, without asking anyone for anything, and why I kept my back to walls in unfamiliar rooms, and why I had never once allowed myself to depend on a person, the way a child depends on a parent, because I had learned at 9 years old what happened when you did. The story was, he left the document in Ray's hand, said, "He stayed." She moved the money and closed the door and told you he left. "How much?" I said. He looked at me. "The child support," I said. "How much did he pay?" He said, "Over 14 years from 2003 to 2017, when you turned 23 and the obligation legally ended. $70,000. Documented. Every payment recorded." I looked at my mother. She was still standing 3 feet to my left. Her expression had not broken. Diane Holt's expressions do not break, the way ordinary people's expressions break. They tighten. They compress. They become more themselves, more controlled, more fixed, as if the performance of composure is the only available response to the threat of its loss. But her hands, at her sides, were very still in the specific way that hands go still when the person they belong to is applying significant conscious effort to keeping them from moving $70,000. 14 years of payments. 14 years of a father fulfilling his legal and financial obligation to a daughter who had been told, with the consistent quiet authority of a mother's certainty, that he had chosen not to. 14 years of money moving into a P.O. box registered to this address and disappearing into this household's finances while I slept in the garage and told myself that I was the kind of person who did not need much. "There's more," Ray said. I looked at him. "I sent you a birthday card every year," he said. "Every October. From 2005, your 11th birthday, through 2017. 13 years. I have the postal records. Every card was sent to this address. I said, I never received them. He said, I know. Here is the thing about growing up believing your father did not remember your birthday. It is not a dramatic grief. It does not announce itself every October with visible, nameable pain. It is quieter than that. A small annual confirmation of a story you have already accepted. A data point that arrives and is filed without ceremony, because you stopped being surprised by it years ago. By the time I was 14, I had stopped expecting a card. By 16, I had stopped thinking about it on my birthday at all, which is the emotional equivalent of closing a tab. You stopped needing, not because the content became irrelevant, but because continuing to check it was costing more than you could afford. He sent a card every year for 13 years. Every year, for 13 years, I said. Where are they? He said. I don't know. I only know they were sent. I looked at the house. The back door was 15 feet away, slightly ajar, the kitchen light visible through the gap. The garage was to the right of the house. The structure with the drywall partition, and the window unit, and the door that locked from the outside. The place where I had spent 4 years of my childhood, sleeping on a bed that was technically mine in a space that had never felt like it was. I said, I need to go inside for a minute. Nobody stopped me. I think the yard had reached the specific social temperature of a gathering that has understood collectively, and without announcement, that something real is happening, and that the normal rules of a birthday party no longer fully apply. Conversations had quieted. People were watching without appearing to watch. The sideways attention of guests who have registered that the evening has shifted, but have not yet decided what their role in the shift should be. I walked through the back door, through the kitchen, where the catering staff moved, with professional efficiency around the evidence of a party still technically in progress. Down the hallway. Past the wall of photographs. Past Frank and Diane's wedding. Past Brenda's graduation. Past Cassie's soccer trophy. Past the Christmas where everyone wore matching sweaters and I was not in the frame. I opened the door to the garage. The partition wall was still there. The room looked different from how I remembered it. The bed was gone, replaced by storage shelving, and the window unit had been upgraded to a newer model. But the proportions were the same: the single overhead light, the slightly uneven floor, the specific smell of a converted space that has never fully decided what it is, part house, part not. I started with the shelving, 3 units, metal, stacked with the organized accumulation of a household's overflow. Holiday decorations, Frank's old tools, boxes of Cassie's childhood books, a vacuum cleaner in its original box. I moved systematically, the way I work through a campaign audit. Left to right, top to bottom. No shelf skipped. I was not sure what I was looking for in terms of its physical form. I was looking for the cards. I knew they existed. I knew they had been sent. I was operating on the reasonable professional assumption that something kept for 14 years is kept somewhere. And somewhere in this house was the most logical location. I found them in a shoebox on the bottom shelf of the 3rd unit, behind a box of Frank's old tax records, pushed to the back of the shelf in the specific way that things are placed when the person placing them wants them to exist in a location that is technically accessible but practically invisible. Not locked away, not destroyed, simply buried under the weight of everything else this house had accumulated. A shoebox, unremarkable, brown. A brand of women's shoes my mother had bought years ago. No label on the outside, no indication of contents. I opened it. 13 envelopes, each one addressed in the same handwriting. Careful, slightly slanted, the handwriting of a man who had thought about what he was writing before he wrote it. Each one addressed to Wanda Holt at this address. Each one with a return address in Dayton, Ohio. Each one still sealed. He had sent them sealed, and they had arrived sealed, and they had been placed in this box sealed, and they had waited here, in this garage, in this house, through my 11th birthday, and my 12th and my 13th, and every birthday, through my 23rd. 13 years of sealed envelopes sitting in a shoebox behind Frank's tax records, while I told myself, with the resigned acceptance of a child who has learned not to expect things, that my father did not remember me. My hands were not shaking. I want to be precise about this because it matters. My hands were not shaking. My breathing was controlled. I was not crying. I was in the specific, suspended state that I have learned to recognize in myself as the moment before the emotion arrives, the moment when the information has been received, and the body is still processing its implications, and the feelings are cued behind a door that has not yet opened. I took the box. I walked back through the garage door, through the kitchen, through the back door, into the yard. Ray saw the box before I reached him. I watched his expression shift, not dramatically, not with the performed emotion of a scene in a movie, but with the quiet, private movement of a face belonging to a person who has just seen confirmation of something they believed, but could not prove. His jaw tightened, his eyes went briefly bright, in the way that eyes go bright when they are doing the work that other people's faces do with their mouths. He said very quietly, "You found them," I said. "They were in the garage." He looked at the box. I looked at my mother, who had followed me back into the yard at a distance and was now standing 12 feet away with Frank beside her. Frank, who had turned 60 today and had known nothing, I was now certain about any of this. Frank's expression was the specific, bewildered devastation of a man who is learning, at his own birthday party, that the house he has lived in for 20 years has been built on a foundation he was never shown. Cassie was beside Frank. Her face was open in the way that Cassie's face went open when she had run out of the energy required to maintain the careful protective neutrality she had kept for years. She looked at the shoebox. She looked at me, and she said, quietly enough that only the people immediately around her could hear, "I always knew something was wrong." It was not an apology yet, but it was the beginning of one. Brenda, from across the yard, said, "Wanda, what are you doing?" Her voice had the sharp, defensive edge of someone whose structure is under threat. "You always make everything about you." Mrs. Patterson, who had not moved from her spot near the fence, said to no one in particular, and everyone simultaneously, "Let the girl speak." I set the shoebox on the table nearest to me, the one with the ivory linen and the half-empty glasses, and the remnants of an evening that had been, until 40 minutes ago, proceeding according to my mother's careful design. I looked at the 13 sealed envelopes, 13 birthdays, 13 years of a man in Dayton, Ohio, sitting down to write to a daughter. He had been blocked from reaching, choosing every year to send something anyway. Not because he knew it would arrive, not because he had any evidence that it was getting through, but because the alternative was silence, and silence felt like surrender, and he had decided, apparently, that he was not willing to surrender. I picked up the first envelope. The postmark said October 2005, my 11th birthday. I looked at Ray. He said, "You don't have to open them now," I said. "I've been waiting 22 years. I opened the envelope. There is a moment in every long deception when the math stops working, not when the lie is discovered. That is a different moment, later, louder. I am talking about the quieter moment before it, the moment when the person who has been managing the deception looks at the evidence in front of them and understands, with the cold clarity of a final accounting, that the numbers no longer add up in their favor, that the columns they have been balancing for years have been seen by someone who knows how to read them. My mother reached that moment at 7:43 p.m. on Frank's 60th birthday. I know the time because I had my phone in my hand when it happened. I was holding the first birthday card. The card was simple, a pale blue envelope, the kind you buy in a grocery store. Inside, a birthday card with a cartoon of a kid on a bicycle on the front, the kind of card a father picks out when he is trying to reach a child. He has not seen and does not know how to reach anymore, except through the ritual of choosing something that feels right and hoping it gets there. Inside, in the careful, slightly slanted handwriting, I now recognized as his Wanda, "Happy 11th birthday. I think about you every single day. I hope you are eating enough vegetables, and that your teacher this year is a good one. I hope you know that somewhere in Dayton, Ohio, your dad is rooting for you, harder than you know. Love, Dad." That was all. No drama, no explanation, no attempt to litigate the divorce or position himself, or say anything about my mother or the situation. Just a father writing to his daughter on her birthday, the way fathers do, when that is the only thing left available to them. I had been 11 years old when he wrote that. I was 31 when I read it. I put it down on the ivory linen tablecloth, picked up the second envelope. The yard had gone almost entirely quiet, not the silence of people who have left. I could see them, the 60 guests, the neighbors and coworkers and garden club women, and Frank's friends from the plant. All of them arranged in the specific, collective stillness of an audience that has stopped pretending to be anything other than an audience. The Italian food sat untouched on the catering table. The 3-tier cake with its gold fondant script stood uncut near the pergola. Someone had turned the music off. I did not notice when, only that it was gone. And the string lights overhead were doing all the work of the atmosphere now. Amber and quiet and entirely indifferent to what was happening beneath them. Frank was still standing near Diane. He had not moved in several minutes. He was watching me open the envelopes with the expression of a man who has been asked a question. He does not yet have the framework to answer. Not anger, not grief, but the specific bewilderment of someone who has just learned that the house he has been living in has a room he did not know existed. Deanne had not spoken since Mrs. Patterson told her this was exactly the time and place. She was watching me with the expression she used when she was deciding something. Not the open, reactive expression of someone responding to events, but the closed, calculating expression of someone trying to determine which move is still available to them. I had seen that expression my entire life. I had learned to read it before I was old enough to name what I was reading. I had always understood, on some level, that my mother operated strategically, that the warmth she deployed was selective, and the coldness was structural, and the arrangement of this family. The wall of photographs, the bedroom assignments, the casual and consistent ways in which I was positioned as peripheral, was not accidental but designed. I had understood this the way children understand things that they cannot yet articulate. Through the body, through accumulated experience, through the pattern of 100 small moments that individually seemed explainable, and collectively told a story too consistent to be coincidence. But understanding a thing and having evidence of it are different. I had the evidence now. If you have ever had a moment where everything you suspected turned out to be true, where the story you told yourself to make the situations bearable turned out to be more accurate than the story you were given, drop a comment, because this is not a satisfying feeling. People imagine it would be, it is not. What it actually feels like is the specific, exhausted grief of a person who has just confirmed that the years they spent, doubting their own perception, were years they could have spent somewhere else entirely. By the 7th card, I had stopped reading every word, not because the words stopped mattering. Each card was its own small, careful document of a father's love, and a father's frustration, and a father's refusal to accept that silence was the same as absence. But because the cumulative weight of them was doing something to my chest that I needed to manage carefully in a yard full of 60 people, and I had learned a long time ago that the way you manage things in public is by keeping your breathing steady and your face controlled and your processing internal until you have the privacy to let it be otherwise. I stacked the opened cards on the table, 13 of them. 13 years of a man in Dayton, writing to his daughter and getting nothing back. Not because his daughter didn't want to respond, but because his daughter never knew to. I looked at my mother. The P.O. box, I said. My voice came out steady. I was surprised briefly at how steady it was, and then I was not surprised, because steadiness under pressure is the only gear I have ever really trusted in myself. The child support payments went to a P.O. box registered in your name at this address, I said. 14 years of payments. $70,000. You told me he never paid. You told the court he wasn't paying when you were receiving every check. Diane said, Wanda, you don't understand the custody petition, I said. He filed for joint custody in 2003. Your attorney argued he was unstable and financially unreliable. He wasn't either of those things. You moved the money and used it as evidence against him. Family law is complicated, she said. There were circumstances. The cards, I said. 13 birthday cards, in a shoebox, in the garage, where you put me. The last sentence landed differently than the others. I had not planned to say it that way. I had not planned any of this. I am a planner by profession and by temperament, And I had walked into this party with nothing more complex than a bottle of scotch and a leather journal, and the low, practiced expectation of an evening I would endure and then drive away from. But the sentence came out. The way true things come out when you have stopped managing them, cleanly, directly, with the specific weight of something that has been accurate for a long time and is being said out loud for the first time in the garage. Where you put me. Frank made a sound, not a word. A sound. The involuntary exhalation of a man receiving information that restructures something fundamental. He looked at Diane. He looked at me. He looked at the shoebox on the table, and the 13 opened cards stacked beside it, and the envelope in Ray's hand and the court documents on the tablecloth. He said very quietly, "Diane." She did not look at him. Here is what I understood. Standing at that table at 7:43 p.m., with the 7th birthday card in my hand, and 58 people watching, and my mother's expression doing its final desperate calculations. She had not been afraid of losing me. She had been afraid of losing control. These are different fears, and they produce different behaviors. And I should have understood the distinction earlier. I had the professional vocabulary for it. I had spent 8 years analyzing the gap between what organizations claimed their motivations were and what their actual decision patterns revealed. But it is harder to apply analytical frameworks to your own family than to a client's brand strategy, and I had extended my mother more interpretive generosity than the evidence warranted. She had not kept me at a distance because she did not love me enough to pull me close. She had kept me at a distance because distance was the mechanism of control. Because a daughter who knew her father loved her was a daughter with somewhere else to belong. Because a daughter with somewhere else to belong was a daughter who could leave, and a daughter who could leave was a variable. Diane Holt could not fully manage, and Diane Holt's entire domestic architecture was built on the elimination of unmanaged variables. The garage was not neglect. The garage was a policy. The missing photographs were not oversight. They were a message, delivered consistently over 22 years to an audience of one, that her position in this family was conditional, and her belonging here was contingent on the absence of alternatives. Ray was the alternative. So Ray had to be made into an absence. "You were not afraid of losing me," I said. Deanne looked at me. "You were afraid of losing control," I said. "Those are different things. And you spent 22 years making sure I never knew the difference." Her expression did something I had never seen it do before. Not breaking. Diane Holt's composure does not break in the way that ordinary composure breaks, suddenly, completely, all at once. It compressed. It became smaller and tighter and more itself, in the way that pressurized things become more themselves when the external structure containing them begins to fail. She said, "Everything I did was for this family." "I was your family," I said. "I was your daughter, and you put me in the garage and took the money and hid the cards and told me for 22 years that my father chose not to know me." I picked up the first card from the stack, the pale blue envelope, the cartoon bicycle. "He remembered every birthday," I said. "He wrote to me every year for 13 years. He filed for custody. He paid $70. 0 in child support to a P.O. box you controlled. He hired a lawyer to trace it 3 years ago." I set the card down. "The only person in my life who did not show up for me was you. And you built the entire story to make it look like him." Brenda said from across the yard, "You don't know everything that happened in this family." Mrs. Patterson said, "Brenda." One word. The specific, quiet authority of a woman in her late 60s who has earned the right to end sentences with a single syllable. Brenda stopped. Cassie, beside Frank, said, "I'm sorry, Wanda." Her voice cracked on the last word. Not performed. The specific, uncontrolled crack of genuine feeling, finding its way out through a sentence that has been held back for too long. I knew something was wrong. I didn't say anything, and I should have. I'm sorry. It was not enough to repair 22 years, but it was real. And in a yard full of performance, real things had started to feel significant. Frank turned to Diane. He was 60 years old, and he had spent those years as a man who believed, I think genuinely, that he was running a household with a woman who was difficult in the ways that difficult people are difficult. Sharp edges, control tendencies, a hierarchy she enforced without fully explaining, but essentially honest. He had believed this because he had not been shown evidence to the contrary, and because it is easier to believe in the version of your life that is already built and furnished and operational than to examine its foundation. He said, "Did you know he was paying?" Diane said, "Frank, did you know he was paying?" He said again, not louder, just clearer. The voice of a man who has asked a question he needs answered before he can process anything else. She did not answer. Which was, in its own way, the answer. Frank looked at the table, at the cards, at the court documents Ray had laid out with the careful, deliberate patience of a man who had been carrying them for years and had finally found the right moment and the right room. He said, "Another man's child support money came into my house." He was not speaking to anyone in particular. He was doing the arithmetic out loud, the way people sometimes do when the numbers are too large to process internally. You used it to argue in court that he wasn't paying. You hid his cards. You put his daughter in the garage. He paused. "And you let me believe it was a normal family." The party was over. Not officially, the cake was still uncut. The string lights were still on. The catering staff was still standing near their table, with the professional stillness of people who have witnessed something they will be processing for weeks and have been trained to continue standing until someone tells them otherwise. But the evening my mother had designed, the performance she had been constructing since February, the statement she had been preparing to make to 60 witnesses about the family she had built and the husband she had made successful and the legacy she was presiding over. That evening was finished. The architecture had failed. Not because I had planned it. Not because Ray had arrived with the intention of destroying anything. But because the distance between the story and the documents had finally collapsed in a room full of people. And once that distance collapses, it cannot be rebuilt in the same evening. I picked up the shoebox. I picked up the 13 cards and placed them carefully back inside and closed the lid. Ray was standing 3 feet away. He had been standing there, quietly, through all of it. Not inserting himself, not escalating, simply present in the way that people are present when they understand that their role in a moment is to witness it rather than drive it. I looked at him. He looked at me. 22 years, 13 cards, $70,000. A custody petition filed in 2003 that I had never known existed. A father in Dayton who had framed my CPA license on his wall before I had any reason to know he knew I had one. I said, "I have a lot of questions." He said, "I have a lot of time." Outside, somewhere beyond the fence, a car started. One of the guests leaving. Quietly, without ceremony, the way people leave situations that have become too real for the social contract they arrived with. Then another. Then the low, collective movement of a party disbanding. Not fleeing, not dramatic. Simply the natural dissolution of an event that has concluded in a way its organizer did not intend. My mother stood near the pergola. Very still, the uncut cake beside her with its gold fondant script. Frank. 60 and still going. Frank was not looking at it. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the garage. There is a specific kind of courage that has nothing to do with loudness. It does not announce itself. It does not require an audience or a dramatic entrance or the right lighting. It is quieter than all of those things. The courage of a person who has been carrying a weight for so long that setting it down feels more terrifying than continuing to carry it, and who sets it down anyway. I had been carrying the story of my father's absence for 22 years. I set it down at 8:04 p.m. on Frank Holt's 60th birthday, in a backyard that smelled of Italian food and October air, and the specific, lingering warmth of string lights that had outlasted the evening they were meant to illuminate. Most of the guests had gone. Not all at once. The departure had been gradual, the way water drains, rather than the way a glass breaks. Couples had found each other across the yard, with the quiet coordination of people who have collectively decided, without discussion, that the correct thing to do is leave. Frank's coworkers had said their goodbyes to Frank specifically, briefly, with the careful avoidance of eye contact with Diane, that told me they had understood what they had witnessed and would be processing it for days. The garden club women had gone in a cluster, moving with the specific, contained energy of people who have just acquired a story. They are not yet sure how to tell, but are certain they will tell it. Mrs. Patterson had not left. She was sitting in one of the white folding chairs near the fence, ankles crossed, hands in her lap, with the settled patience of a woman who had decided she was staying until she knew how this ended. She had watched me open every card. She had said nothing through the confrontation with Diane, nothing through Frank's quiet devastation, nothing through Cassie's cracked apology, and Brenda's defensive retreat into the house. She had simply remained, a witness, steady and unperforming, the way witnesses should be. I appreciated that more than I had words for. The 13 cards were in the shoebox in my hands. I had been holding the box since I picked it up from the table, and I had not put it down, and I understood on some level that I was not going to put it down tonight. These were mine. They had been mine for 22 years, traveling toward me through 13 Octobers, waiting in a garage I had been assigned to, instead of a bedroom I had been promised. They were the most concrete proof I had that I had been wanted. Not in the abstract, not in theory, not in the complicated and conditional way that Diane's household had wanted me, but specifically, annually, with cartoon bicycles and carefully chosen words and a return address in Dayton, Ohio. I was not going to put them down. Ray was beside me, not close, not in the presumptuous way of someone claiming a proximity they had not yet earned. 3 feet away, which had become, over the course of this evening, our working distance, close enough to speak, far enough to give me the room I needed to process without feeling managed. He had good instincts about space. I noted that. Filed it, I said. The license. He looked at me. Your sister, Jolene, I said. You told Cassie earlier. You framed my CPA license on your wall. He said. I did. How did you know I passed? He said. I've been following your career since I found your LinkedIn profile in 2016. I know you work at Meridian Group. I know you built the Callaway campaign. I know you were promoted twice in 3 years. He paused. I printed the license announcement from your firm's website. Jolene bought the frame. I looked at him, the marketing part of my brain. The part that never fully clocks out. Registered the specific quality of that information. He had not been absent. He had been watching from the only distance available to him, through the publicly accessible record of a daughter who had built a professional life. He had not been permitted to be part of, finding the evidence of her success in press releases and company websites and LinkedIn updates, and framing it on his wall in Dayton, because it was the closest thing to being there that the last 22 years had allowed him. My chest did the thing again. The thing I had been managing since the 7th birthday card. I let it. If you have ever discovered that someone loved you from a distance you didn't know they were watching from, drop a comment, because I do not have a clean word for what that feels like. It is not simple happiness. It is not simple grief. It is both of those things at the same time, layered over each other, like 2 transparencies placed one on top of the other. And the image they make together is something you have to look at for a long time before you can describe it accurately. Diane was still in the yard. She was standing near the pergola, the uncut birthday cake beside her, the gold fondant script reflecting the string lights in a way that would have been pretty under different circumstances. Frank had gone inside 20 minutes ago. Not dramatically, not with a declaration, just a quiet withdrawal that communicated more than a speech would have. He had looked at Diane once before he went inside, one long, exhausted look. Then he had walked through the back door and closed it behind him, with the careful, deliberate softness of a man who is choosing not to slam it. Brenda was inside. She had retreated shortly after Mrs. Patterson silenced her. Not in defeat exactly, but in the specific, strategic withdrawal of someone who recognizes that the room has turned and is repositioning for the next engagement. Cassie was still in the yard. She was sitting at the edge of the catering table, not eating, not doing anything in particular, existing in the open and slightly undone state she had been in since her apology. Every so often she looked at me. I looked back. There was nothing resolved between us. Not yet. Not tonight. But the looking was different from how it had always been. It had stopped being avoidant. That was something. Deanne walked toward me. I watched her come. She moved with the same controlled efficiency she always moved with, but something in it had changed. The efficiency was the same, but the confidence behind it was different, compressed, operating under a load it had not been designed to carry. She stopped at a distance slightly greater than our normal conversational distance, which told me she had registered on some level that the normal rules of our proximity no longer automatically applied. She said, "I want to explain." I said, "Okay," she said. "When Ray and I divorced, I was alone with a 9-year-old and no income, and a man he was not stable, Wanda. He had problems. He was not the person you are looking at right now. People change." Ray, to my right, said nothing. I said, "The custody petition." She said, "I was protecting you," I said, "from a man who sent me a birthday card every year for 13 years and paid $70.00 in child support and hired a lawyer to find out where his money was going." She said, "It was complicated." "The garage," I said. She stopped. "I want you to explain the garage," I said. "I want you to explain the photographs on the wall. I want you to explain every birthday where you told me he didn't remember. Every year I asked if he had called, and you said no. Every time I asked why he left, and you gave me an answer that you knew was not true." Her expression did the compression thing. Tighter, smaller, more itself. She said, "I did what I thought was right for this family." "I was your family," I said. "I was your daughter. Not Frank's family. Not Brenda's family, yours. And you gave up my father, and you gave up my childhood, and you kept the money, and you put me on the floor, and you hung photographs of everyone else on the wall." I looked at her steadily. "You did not do what was right for this family. You did what was right for your control of it, and you used me as the variable you could most afford to manage." Diane Holt's composure, in that moment, did something I had never seen in 53 years of being her daughter. It failed. Not loudly. Not with the dramatic collapse of a movie scene. It failed the way a structural system fails under load. Gradually, from the inside, the visible surface holding its shape for a moment after the interior has already given way. Her chin moved. Her eyes went bright in the way that eyes go bright when the tear ducts have been overruled by the face, for as long as the face is capable of overruling them. Her hands at her sides finally moved. A small, involuntary gesture, reaching for something that was not there. She said, "I didn't want to lose you." I said, "You lost me when I was 9 years old. You just didn't tell me." I picked up the shoebox. I looked at Mrs. Patterson, who gave me a small nod from her folding chair. Not goodbye exactly, more like confirmation. I saw this, it happened. It was real. I looked at Cassie, who was watching me with her eyes open and her expression undone, and something in her face that was asking a question she did not yet know how to form into words. I said, "I'll call you." She nodded. I meant it. I looked at the wall of photographs visible through the kitchen window. The hallway, the matching frames, the official record of a family that had arranged itself without me. I looked at it the way I had looked at it, hundreds of times before, but differently now. Not as evidence of my exclusion, as evidence of a story that was about to be rewritten, whether this house was ready for that or not. I walked toward the gate. Ray fell into step beside me. Not ahead, not behind, exactly beside, at the 3-foot working distance that had become our language for the evening. We walked through the gate together and out onto the sidewalk in front of the house, into the October night air that smelled of dry leaves and the particular, clean coldness of a season changing. We stood on the sidewalk. The string lights were still visible above the fence. The yard was quiet. Inside the house, the lights in Frank's study were on. Ray said, "I have a long drive back to Dayton," I said. "I know," he said. "Jolene wants to meet you. She has been wanting to meet you for a long time." I looked at the shoebox in my hands. 13 cards. 13 years of a man choosing to write rather than accept silence. I said, "I have questions, a lot of them. About your life, about what happened, about all of it," he said. "I have time for all of them." A car passed on the street. The October air moved through the oak trees along the block. Somewhere down the street, a neighbor's porch light was on, amber and steady. The ordinary nighttime geography of a neighborhood that had no idea what had just happened. 3 houses down. Ray said, "Good night, pumpkin." The word hit me somewhere I was not prepared for, pumpkin. I did not know he had ever called me that. I had no memory of it. I had been 9 when I lost him, and 9-year-old memories are incomplete in the way that all early memories are incomplete. More feeling than detail, more texture than content. But the word arrived with the specific, physical weight of something that is not new, but is being heard for the first time in a very long time, and my chest did the thing it had been doing all evening. and this time I did not manage it. I said, "Good night, Dad." 22 years, 2 syllables. He looked at me, and his face did the thing that faces do. When a person has been waiting for something for so long, that receiving it requires a moment of stillness before any other response is available. Then he nodded, once. The nod of a man who has just closed a distance he has been crossing for 2 decades. He walked to his car. I stood on the sidewalk and watched him go. 1 week later, I drove to Dayton on a Saturday morning, with the windows down, and the shoebox on the passenger seat, and a list of questions in my phone's notes app that had grown over 7 days to 34 items. Ray's house was a brick bungalow on a quiet street, with a maple tree in the front yard that had gone completely red in the October cold. Jolene met me at the door before I had finished walking up the path. A woman in her early 50s with Ray's eyes and a smile that had clearly been waiting for this specific Saturday, for longer than she was going to tell me directly. She hugged me, not the careful, calibrated hug of someone performing warmth. The hug of a woman who has wanted to do this for 22 years and is not wasting another second of the opportunity. She said, into my shoulder, "We have been waiting for you." Inside, on the wall of the living room, between a framed photograph of Jolene's kids and a calendar from a local hardware store, was my CPA license, printed from my firm's website, in a frame that Jolene had clearly chosen with care, dark wood, clean glass, centered on the wall at eye level, not in a box in a garage, on the wall. Where things go when they matter, I stood in front of it for a long moment. Ray came in from the kitchen with 2 mugs of coffee and set one on the side table near me and said nothing, because nothing was required. I sat down. We talked for 2 hours. He told me about Dayton, about the job he had held for 15 years, and the neighborhood he had lived in, and the routines of a life built quietly, without the daughter he had been trying to reach, shaped in ways both large and small by her absence. He told me about the lawyer he had hired in 2019 to trace the P.O. box. He told me about the morning. He confirmed what he had suspected, that the payments had been received, that the address was Diane's, that 20 years of child support had arrived and been used and never acknowledged, and how he had sat in his car outside the lawyer's office for 40 minutes before he was ready to drive home. He told me about the LinkedIn profile, about finding it in 2016 and reading every post and following every update and printing the CPA announcement and handing it to Jolene and saying, "She's doing well. Look, she's doing well." I asked him 31 of my 34 questions. The other 3 I decided could wait for next time. There would be a next time. I was certain of that now. 3 weeks later, on a Sunday evening, I sat in my apartment with the shoebox open on the coffee table. All 13 cards spread out in front of me, organized by year, 2005 through 2017, 11 to 23. The entire architecture of a childhood and an early adulthood, mapped in pale blue envelopes and careful handwriting, and the annual, faithful unanswered effort of a man in Dayton who had refused to accept that silence meant it was over. I picked up my phone. I called him. He answered on the second ring. I said, "Hey, Dad, what are you doing Saturday?" A pause. The specific warm pause of a person, smiling on the other end of a phone line. He said, "I know a place. They make the best pie in Dayton. Jolene's been trying to take you there since last week." I looked at the 13 cards on my coffee table. I said, "I'll be there by noon." I hung up. Outside my apartment window, the October sky had gone dark, and the city lights were doing what city lights do, filling the darkness with the evidence of ordinary life continuing, block by block, in all directions, indifferent and constant and entirely unaware that somewhere in one lit window, a 31-year-old woman was sitting with 13 birthday cards and the phone still warm in her hand, feeling, for the first time in 22 years, that she knew exactly where she belonged. Not in a garage, not at the edge of a family photograph, not in the careful, managed distance of a household that had arranged itself without her. Somewhere in Dayton, Ohio, where a man had framed her license on his wall, where an aunt had been waiting to hug her for 22 years, where the pie was apparently worth the drive. She smiled. And for the first time in a very long time, Wanda Holt did not feel abandoned.